Okay, in a previous video, I presented McElroy's biography of Grover Cleveland, um, covering the material from his birth as a child of a Puritan, Sabbath-keeping, catechism-learning, strict upbringing, to his election as the President of the United States, and including an amazing four-year period in 81 to 84, where he went from mayor of Buffalo to governor of New York to president of the United States. Now we're ready to cover his administration, his first administration, in some detail. His first distinguishing mark was, again, giving appointments based largely on merit rather than party loyalty. And again, this was kind of bucking the tradition that had been received, but which all right-thinking Americans desired, but was very hard to achieve because of the fact that when you are the winning party, the temptation is just so great to reward the fellow travelers, many of whom sacrificed a lot of their time and money and set their career, and so there's a strong argument in many cases, but Grover Cleveland resisted this. A second theme of his presidency was apparently for a couple of generations, this advice and consent clause of the Constitution. You recall that means that when the president appoints certain positions like ambassadors and cabinet members and judgeships, the Senate is supposed to vote to approve, and that comes under this rubric of advice and consent. And during the 19th century, at least, this had become another theme for struggle between the presidency and the Congress. And Congress at various times tried to push their right to advice and consent even further, to say that not only do we have to approve appointments, but we also have to approve firing anybody. So you can't get rid of anybody without our advice and consent. And then that even had passed at a certain time, and then later been rescinded and so forth. So there was this back and forth. And in either case, the pork barreling, the trading deals, and in exchange for the vote to approve of an appointment, had become another source of, frankly, corruption. I mean, people voting for your appointment only because you agree, you made the deal behind back doors that your state will get some contracts. So we know that kind of thing goes on today. Even Trump promises when he goes to Wisconsin to give this and that. When he goes to Michigan, he promises to do special things to bring the auto industry back, and so forth. Each state he goes to, you can see this pattern very clearly. And that had infected the advice and consent, I think, to a far greater extent, at least as far as I'm aware of, than what it is today. We obviously have the pork barrel stuff, like say in the budget formation, but at this time it was also even in things like advice and consent. So he pushed back on that tendency and managed to regain a certain amount of power of the president as opposed to the Senate. And notice that an interesting feature of American politics is that there are struggles between, like, say, Congress and the presidency that take place that kind of cut through party lines, so that even if they're both the same party, there's going to be some tension and tug of war and struggle just by the nature of the office. So not everything is just purely party politics. A third feature of Grover Cleveland's presidency was the veterans' pensions. And at this time, Congress had awarded a system of giving pensions to disabled soldiers only of the Union cause. And so this was a very delicate matter because it's human nature that lots of people were coming forward with claims that weren't really valid. Like, oh, I've got a crick in my back, and that was because I fought at the Battle of Sigwamani or whatever. And, I caught malaria, and that led into my... So you'd have just endless. McElroy gives just an endless litany of case examples of quite absurd claims for pensions. And Grover Cleveland spent a great deal of time studying each one and judging it on its merits. It was also, as with so many of these themes, we get this um, push-pull or balance that has to be um, navigated, even on matters that you would think would be uh, kind of objective and not really partisan. In this case, the danger that he had was that the southern states weren't getting any federal money for their veterans. And so their states tried to provide for their veterans out of their state funds, but then also they have to pay to the federal government, which is giving pensions, but only to union. And so this was a very prickly situation because, of course, as mentioned before, the South, the solid South, was the um, bastion of Democratic support until they were able to rebuild more support in the North. And yet they couldn't um, make too many motions. The Northern Democrats couldn't be seen to be placating Southern feelings too much without raising the ire of veterans of the Union Army. And of course, demagogues that would exploit that for their own purpose. The veterans themselves, as the author points out, had achieved reconciliation, and often you had Union and Confederate soldiers having reunions on battlefields and having a very brotherly time. But politicians had kept this tension going, and so Grover Cleveland had, because of his resistance to corruption, he examined these claims and rejected quite a few of them, but he had to do it in such a way as not to feed the too much of the fire of, well, you're just trying to suppress our glorious Union heroes' well-deserved rewards in order to placate Southerners. And so that's why this is kind of interest. The fourth major theme of Cleveland's first term in office was what you might call Indian affairs, or the relationship to the Indian tribes. The author explains how, since the 1830s, many of the Indian tribes had allotments or reservations east of the Mississippi, but they had been persuaded, is the word he uses, to move west of the Mississippi into the territories, essentially, territories of the U.S. that were not yet incorporated as states, using the argument that as long as they were in states, then they would be subject to the vicissitudes and whims of states. But by going out to the territories, they would come under U.S. protection and thereby have more guarantees of their tribal integrity and so forth. So many of the tribes did, in fact, do that. And some of them were actually quite successful in establishing their own kind of quasi-nation within a nation. And specifically, 5 of the tribes were known as the 5 civilized tribes. These were the Cherokees, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Creeks, and the Seminoles. This is still before Cleveland's day, and right before his term, the thinking had started to evolve. This idea of separate nations was not really tenable, and they needed to be brought under U.S. law and U.S. jurisdiction. And Chester Arthur specifically kind of pulled a trick 5 days before he left office to be succeeded by Cleveland. He issued a executive order, I guess, or whatever he called the pronouncement, that as of May 1875, that is 3 or 4 months after he would leave office, the Winnebago and Crow Creek lands were going to be opened up for white settlement. And so even before that date arrived, some settlers rushed in and started staking out claims. Others were following the letter of the law, of the pronouncement. I shouldn't say law, the pronouncement, and were kind of hovering along the border, and it was starting to create quite a tense situation. In parallel with that, I don't know if it's the same lands or a different reservation, but cattle kings, as they were called, had worked out lease arrangements with some of the Indians to lease grazing lands for their cattle. And the terms of these leases called for 1 to 2 cents per acre per year. Now, Harris's law for converting pre-Federal Reserve dollars to current dollars is a factor of 40. I used 30 until COVID, and now I use 40 after the inflation from COVID. Perhaps even 50 would be more. But if you think about it, 1 to 2 cents, even adjusting for inflation, you're talking like 50 cents or $1 per year per acre. So a pretty sweet deal. And not only that, but the lease arrangements provided that any damage that the cattle suffered had to be compensated for by the Indians. In addition, there was no taxes paid on this land. So obviously, this was a very exploitative arrangement. This is an example of how the libertarian justification of free contracts fails, because you're dealing with a party where there's lack of understanding of the implications. So 90% of the this particular reservation was gobbled up with this lease, which probably seemed good at the moment, but it was based on a lack of understanding of liabilities and values and things like that the cattlemen exploited. Well, in both of these respects, both the pronouncement by Chester Arthur and the cattle leases, Cleveland stepped up to the plate, and he canceled Chester Arthur's pronouncement as being ultra vires, meaning outside of his jurisdiction to have ever made, and made it clear that the white settlers would be ejected. And he nullified the cattlemen's leases on the grounds that the original reservation treaties had specified that no such contracts could be made without U.S. approval, and U.S. approval had not been given. So they weren't even legal technically under the treaty laws. And Cleveland sustained a great deal of lobbying from the cattlemen to relent and to see it to be okay after all. But he held his ground very firmly. As things continued to develop, though, Congress saw that the reservation system was not really tenable in the long run. And so they passed legislation to seek to convert the Indian properties to fee simple, meaning to have individual severable titles to plots of land governed by titles like we have in our system. And it was fairly generous. Each man, woman, and child would be given an allotment of between 40 and 320 acres. I'm assuming that much range was depending on the desirability of the land. So 40 acres, I'm guessing, if the land was very desirable, well watered and so forth. 320 acres if it was more scruffy, not really cultivatable and things like that. And so that was just starting to become put into action when all of a sudden the Apaches went on the warpath in the Southwest Territory under the leadership of Geronimo. And there were tremendous depredations being threatened, but then the European people, the white settlers, pushed back under military leadership with even more harshness, to the point where even Mark Twain intervened and wrote a letter to the president that I'll read here. Mark Twain was not just like your bleeding heart type of guy. I mean, he had written fairly poignantly about Indian massacres in Minnesota, but here he took the opposite tack. McElroy says on page 229, General Crook had at once opened pursuit upon what he termed these tigers of the human race, and the local authorities had vigorously seconded him, adopting methods so ferocious as to cause Mark Twain to send the following protest to the president. You not only have the power to destroy scoundrelism of many kinds in this country, but you have amply proved that you have also the unwavering disposition and purpose to do it. End of quote. As convincing proof that scoundrelism existed among the chosen guardians of Indian lands, he enclosed the following official notice from the Southwest Sentinel of Silver City, New Mexico. $250 reward. And again, by my rule, that would be like $10,000 today. The above reward will be paid by the Board of County Commissioners of Grant County to any citizen of said county for each and every hostile renegade Apache killed by such citizen, on presentation to said board of the scalp of such Indian. By order of the board, E. Stein, clerk. Mark Twain's appeal, however, fell upon deaf ears. Sensitive as he was to the cry of injustice and inhumanity, Mr. Cleveland was equally conscious of the demands of law and order. His was not the type of character to spin theories of justice while neglecting to provide that indispensable prerequisite to justice, the protection of life and property. The Indians had appealed to the sword. To this, as he saw it, but one reply was possible. Those who take the sword shall perish by the sword. He therefore made no effort to stay the hand that smites. Warfare with the Apaches led to the Apaches being defeated and rounded up and imprisoned, essentially. And so that kind of put a hitch in the ongoing process of trying to negotiate a more permanent arrangement with the with the reservations, such that Grover Cleveland lost his second term initially, and President Harrison resumed office. And the first thing he did was he opened up the Oklahoma reservations to being settled by whites, which was contrary to the agreement made with the Seminoles that there would be no white settlers. And then in 1890, he did the same for the Sioux tribe of South Dakota. Now, in fairness, the reservation system had become untenable with a couple of specific problems. One is that it was apparently quite difficult to actually enforce keeping settlers out of the reservations. I'm not sure exactly why. It seems like that wouldn't be that hard to do, but probably because of deals that the settlers would make with Indians and give them some money on the side and, stake out a claim. And after a while, you got a farm there, and then nobody's quite sure. And then the other problem was that outlaws that would be robbing wagon trains and railroads in the Great Plains, could then withdraw into an Indian reservation and escape extradition and escape enforcement that way. So everybody knew that there was really not going to be a good long-term solution. I'll read McElroy's way of describing this. He says on page 235, in defiance of American law, but often with the eager connivance of the Indians whose property that law was designed to protect, Negroes and white settlers had invaded the territory until they outnumbered the Indians 6-1. Moreover, just beyond their boundaries lay the recently opened regions, full of new settlers, many of them lawless, desperate men, who robbed trains, murdered travelers, and otherwise plied the profession of knights of the road with comparative impunity. When too hard pressed by the officers of the law, these desperadoes jumped the borders into one of the 5 Indian republics where, in view of the lack of extradition arrangements with the United States, they remained as free as Robin Hood and twice as lawless. Of course, such a situation could not be tolerated. A short time before the inauguration of March 4th, 1893, i.e., Grover Cleveland's second term, a committee of the Senate declared, "Their system of government cannot be continued. It cannot be reformed. It must be abandoned and a better one substituted." And Mr. Cleveland, as chief executive, was expected to point the way. The legislation that had been passed to give acreage to the every man, woman, and child, 40 to 320 acres. The name of that, by the way, was the Indian Emancipation Act. And whenever you see federal legislation with a name touting emancipation or freedom or patriotism, run as fast as you can in the other direction would be my rule. Think of the Patriot Act under the W. But at any rate, Dawes from Massachusetts was sort of the architect of that legislation, and Cleveland appointed him to head up a commission to try to negotiate these deals with the Indian tribes. He made it very clear, Cleveland did, that no coercion was to be threatened or let alone exercised, that the transition, he felt, was indeed needed, but it needed to be done voluntarily and by persuasion. By the end of his term, the 5 civilized tribes, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminoles, had signed agreements. So as we evaluate Grover Cleveland's role in this saga, we can see that, as in other issues that had come before him, such as the relation between corporations and common man, he always had an eye on the underdog and bent over backwards, at least from the point of view of our civilization, to grant them the rights that had been given to them and to not coerce, but on the other hand, to meet force with force, as with the Apache situation. What we see here is a clash between two civilizations that are not compatible. You know, you have from our civilization, the European civilization, should I say, you have the notion of titles to property, which are registered in clerks' offices and enforced by sheriffs and so forth. Whereas with the Indian tribes, you didn't have that at all. You had a tribal sense of presence, and the land as a whole was being occupied by them. But then they might move on to a different land perhaps later if they're the mobile type of tribe. And so it was just a totally fundamentally incompatible kind of system. And I don't think the problem with the remaining tribes is over. I mean, I think that the issues will eventually rear their ugly head again as the land fills up more and more densely with people. We sort of have the luxury of a lightly populated, comparatively, lands out in the plains and the west, which kind of makes a situation that would be untenable anywhere else in the world livable. But eventually that will end, and so and if at no other time, when the U.S. government empire finally falls. So I think that these issues illustrated historically in this story of Grover Cleveland will continue to be relevant and useful for us to study. The fifth major theme of the Cleveland administration was the goings-on with the Samoan Islands. And so I thought I would go through that a little bit. First of all, just to kind of place the Samoan Islands in the world geography, you know, you have California, the west coast of the U.S. here, and then you have, let's say, Australia over here. And let's draw Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands here, and then the Samoan Islands roughly here. And each of these 3 legs is very close to 2,500 miles. Coincidentally enough. And recall that some 20 years earlier, before Grover Cleveland, Commodore Perry had opened up trade with Japan by a combination of guns and butter. In other words, he kind of brought gunships in and said, we need help with you protecting our seamen, and while you're at it, we'd like to set up some trade. And sort of, never really threatened direct violence, but just through commanding presence, induced the Japanese to open up their country to be a way station for damaged American vessels in the region, and also possibly to be able to start trading. Now, 20 years later, the Samoan Islands came under some American influence in a manner that I'll describe in a second. But recall also that the navies, both merchant and military, were converting to steam power during this period. And so you needed to have stops along the way to reload coal, essentially. And so this position of the Samoan Islands, as you can see, was propitious for that, on the way to Australia and Japan being up here. And 2,500 miles each of these legs is kind of an amazing coincidence. So anyhow, Commodore Perry had opened up Japan in 1853. And almost 20 years later, in 1872, some American vessels worked out a permanent right to dock at the harbor in Pago Pago, or as I'm led to believe, should be called Pungo Pungo. I thought I would draw a quick detailed map here. Get the better glass. Get rid of Australia here. The Samoan Islands includes basically one in the middle, one on the left, and one on the right, to first approximation. And the scales that we're talking about, so this is, a blow up of what's shown here. And the rough scales, this is roughly 20 miles across. And the important geographical feature here is called, is this protrusion over here called Cape Mulinulu. Then the main island is about 40 miles across. And its main harbor is right here and called Apia. And there's a little island in the harbor, or not the harbor, but in between the two here, that will play a little bit of a role here shortly. That one is called Manono. And then way over here, this little guy here, its harbor is the one that I mentioned, Pungo Pungo. But if I say Pago Pago, then forgive me. And this one's about 10 miles across. And the distance from here from the middle to the right-hand one is roughly 50 miles, let's say. So the American vessel opened up the right to this harbor over here. Script's down here. Let me rewrite Pago Pago up here. 3 years later, another American adventurer named Steinberger, German name, but he was American, somehow finagled with the natives to gin up a constitution modeled after the U.S. Constitution, with himself designated as the premier. So, so that's how things were kind of done, I guess, in those days. This was during the presidency of Grant. Then 2 years into the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, a treaty was made that opened up the other ports, so Apia and perhaps other ones not shown here. And the treaty specified a separation of jurisdiction. So if the American was accused of something or got in trouble, he'd be tried by American courts, and vice versa. If the Samoan, he would be tried by Samoan courts. But the main point was for that to be the framework to opening up all the ports for trade. Now, meanwhile, both Germany and United Kingdom, or England, were also jockeying for position, not only in this island cluster, but in many of the islands throughout the South Seas. And in 1879, still in Rutherford B. Hayes's reign, the three powers, U.S., U.K., and Germany, made a treaty among themselves that none of them were going to establish the Samoan Islands as their own. You know, they were all going to be free to trade, but each of them was going to take a hands-off approach. Another agreement called the Apia Agreement. All three powers were going to help maintain law and order on the islands, but under the Samoan flag. So in other words, none of them would be claiming primary jurisdiction. Now, within about a week of the election of Grover Cleveland in November of '84, the German influence became much more dominant. And we're talking mainly about these islands over here, to the point where the king of Samoa, King Malietoa, protested to the Kaiser about their treatment. Now recall that Germany itself was just recently coalesced as a single nation state under Bismarck, and the King of Prussia established as the Kaiser of the German Empire. So these were the players that were involved now with, Malietoa registered this protest just as Cleveland was coming into the picture here. So the Germans, however, continued to flex their muscles, and they did so by inveigling themselves in with a rival king, Tamasis. So they were making a deal with Tamasis to kind of like muscle out Malietoa as the proper king of Samoa. And in January of '85, which would have been, again, within weeks of when Cleveland actually was installed as president, the Germans made the move and seized Molineux, which would be this island, and Apia, which is this island here. By the time May of that year, or of the following year, so a little bit more than a year into Cleveland's administration, Malietoa appealed to the U.S. for help, appealing to those previous treaties that had been signed. And but he did so by talking to the consul that was local, named Greenbaum. And Greenbaum took unilateral action to try to oppose the Germans. And both Germany and UK resisted him on the grounds that he had no authorization to intervene. So the upshot was that the American administration proposed a tripartite conference to straighten out the deal. Now, yet another year went by while they were preparing for this conference, and Cleveland's Secretary of State Bayard wrote to the German Secretary of State Alvensleben, asking that their agent on the islands, Brandeis, should cease and desist from fomenting rebellion under Thomases. And so I'll read that letter. This is again U.S. Bayard writing to the German equivalent, Alvensleben. Sir, this is page 248. It is proper I should acquaint you with the purport of a dispatch just received at this department and dated January 31st, 1887, from the American Vice Consul at Apia. It is stated in substance that Mr. Brandeis, lately connected with the German consulate at Apia, has been sent under pay and with the title of General to give military instruction to Thomases in promotion of his rebellion against the government of Malietoa. The vice consul further states that this action has been made the subject of earnest remonstrance by Malietoa to the Imperial German government. I trust that the just and benevolent plan of cooperation by the three powers will not be allowed to be impeded by any such inconsistent and maleficent action as has been so reported, and if any such steps have been taken, that your government will promptly check such action by its officials and under color of their approval. Signed, Bayard. So Alvensleben denied that this was taking place, kind of obfuscated. So it kind of muddled along for a couple more months, 3 more months, until in June, this tripartite conference actually took place in America. And up until then, the UK had sided with the US on the kind of a hands-off, non-intervention policy. But now when the conference took place, the Americans found to their chagrin that the UK had switched to taking Germany's side. And what had happened was the Germans and the British had sort of secretly made a deal of divvying up all the islands of the South Pacific. And so Britain was willing to cede Samoa to the Germans in exchange for non-interference with their properties in various places. Kind of reminds me of the Churchill-Stalin plan for dividing up Europe, the Naughty Conference, as it's called, during World War II. But at any rate, that was the upshot. And on August, that very same year, Alvensleben announced that war was actually declared against Malietoa. And I'll read a section from the book that kind of makes this context more clear. This was a notice in the Berlin Tageblatt from a month earlier. Quote, "These little groups of islands cannot remain independent forever, and it is therefore to be urgently wished that Germany should not exhibit too much delicacy with respect to Samoa, but take it while it is to be had. America would have no serious objection to such a course, for her motto is trade, no dominion, and England would joyfully give her assent if she were permitted in payment, therefore, to lay her hands on the Tonga Islands." So there you see pretty clearly spelled out what the deal was. So the war on Malietoa continued, and the Germans demanded that Malietoa, I guess he was suppressed, and they demanded that he pay an indemnity for their costs of keeping the peace, I guess, and also that he pay homage by crawling on his belly to them ceremoniously and ignominiously. And this took place in September of that year, and then they whisked him off. So Malietoa is gone. Thomases is now the putative king of Samoa. Notice that in all cases, the European powers are jockeying to be the main power, but it's never just a matter of like wiping out the population and colonizing it. It's always making deals with local chieftains and kings and fiefdoms within the islands, and then claiming, in exchange for protection, to recognize them as the lawful king of the islands. So anyway, Malietoa is out, Thomases is in. So over the next year, the tensions continued to build because not all the islanders were happy with Tamasis, and the third pretender to the throne named Mateafa started to rebel, gather rebels, and push back in the vacuum left by Malietoa. So Brandeis, the German agent, overplayed his hand, so much so that Tamasis threatened to bolt from the arrangement, probably fearing that he would be deposed and not dealt with properly. But then Brandeis blackmailed Tamasis by threatening to withdraw all of his support. So sort of a passive-aggressive move, that the Germans would withdraw and then Tamasis would be massacred by Mateafa's force. So Tamasis came back into the fold, and the Germans also, Brandeis threatened to destroy Monona, as an example, this little island here. So he told them, look, we're going to go and burn down everything in Monona as an example of what's going to happen to you if you guys get out of line again. But at any rate, for the next year, the fighting continued, and the forces of Mateafa finally did beat Tamasis and the Germans, and immediately the U.S. recognized Mateafa. And at this point, we've reached January '89, which is the around the time that Cleveland is about to leave after being defeated for what should have been his second term. But he made a speech to Congress to maintain the Samoan independence. And so he was trying to both carry forth George Washington's dictum to not become entangled with other European powers, particularly on the one hand, but on the other hand, to leave native populations as free as possible to make their own destiny. So this was kind of his closing speech to Congress. The Germans continued to apply the pressure and sending more warships. And then now under President Harrison, the U.S. sent warships also. And it was actually building up to the point where there could have been a U.S.-German war breaking out in early '89 when a hurricane hit and destroyed both mini navies. I mean, each of them had like 4, 5, 6, 8 warships in the harbor, and they were all scuttled, or they were all destroyed by the hurricane. So God intervened to prevent the war from breaking out, and this led to Germans calling a new conference of the tripartite parties. This was called the Berlin Conference. They met in Berlin. And so they once again worked out a tripartite shared protectorate to govern Samoa. Malietoa was restored. Bismarck abandoned Tamasis and returned Malietoa to the island to be the continuing ruler. And he withdrew Brandeis from being the on-site supervisor. So to all appearances, it looked as though Germany was throwing in the towel on its belligerence and acceding to the results of the conference. However, by the very act of getting this deeply entangled, the Americans for the first time were disobeying Father Washington's instruction to not get entangled. I'll read McElroy's summary here on page 261. He says, membership in the Triple Alliance entered by the United States in disregard of the warnings of Grover Cleveland meant that for the first time since Washington issued his farewell warning against entangling alliances, we were involved in just such an alliance. By the irony of fate, it worked well enough to tide over the 4 years of President Harrison, who on March 4th, 1893, returned the executive office to Mr. Cleveland with the Samoan question again demanding question. So Harrison's rule was sort of like a little parenthesis, and then Cleveland came back in. And the upshot is that Cleveland's efforts to maintain the Washington-Cleveland non-entangling alliance while maintaining the liberty of the islands failed, essentially. And by 1900, Germany had regained control of, again, these islands. So meanwhile, these quiet little part on the right, Pungo Pungo, was still under American control. And as things continued to develop in the early decades of the 1900s, Germany, this was one of their principalities then. And America had this section of now called American Samoa. Then in World War I, the New Zealanders seized control as part of the tactics of World War I. And in the settlement after the war, this was stripped from Germany as one of its possessions and put under the oversight of New Zealand, where it remained for decades until much later in the century, New Zealand ceded full control and autonomy. So that this is now, today, Apia and Mulinu'u are now their own independent nation of Samoa, while this smaller chunk to the east here, 50 miles to the east, with Pungo Pungo, is American Samoa. So that kind of explains, you've probably seen in political conventions, Republicans and Democrats, a delegation from American Samoa. That's where this all comes from. My own evaluation is that the author shows a bit of an anti-German bias in his description. I myself can see the point of view of pretty much all three players. You know, you had the Americans at this stage were pretty much non-interventionist in desiring the liberty of each nation. The Germans were basically saying, we're people too. You know, we're a powerful country. We should have, if you guys have your colonies, we should have our colonies. If you have your trading outposts, we should have our trading outposts. I can't blame them for having that desire. And then Britain was sort of in between these two, with similar Anglo-Saxon traditions as the Americans, wanting freedom and independence, but at the same time having the largest navy in the world and having no intention of letting go of its empire. So it was kind of like double-mindedly jockeying around and making separate pieces and so forth to maintain their own position. So I can kind of see all three points of view. But I guess for the U.S. specifically, this was the thing that set the stage for abandoning George Washington's advice to the nation to avoid entangling alliances. And then in the subsequent Republican administration of McKinley, and then increasing to an extreme extent under Wilson and so forth, and now up to the present where America is basically an empire, things have changed quite a bit. Finally, the sixth theme of Cleveland's presidency that I'll discuss briefly concerns the tariff. And in the last year of his first term, he took up a study of the tariff question, which, as you recall, had been a thorn in the side of American politics since at least the 1830s. And originally had been something favored by Northerners because it seemed to favor their industries, and opposed by Southerners because the South depended on trade with England and France, trading cotton for manufactured goods. And by adding a tariff, you simply reduce the amount of exchange that they're able to get compared to no tariff. However, you know, the tariff was the chief form of revenue generation for the U.S. government at that time. And one reason Grover Cleveland took an interest in this question was that the revenues greatly exceeded the expenditure of the federal government. I mean, imagine that. They were running huge surpluses. So he thought that we should reduce that, and that's because his reasoning was that the tariff is essentially a tax on those people that pay it. And not only that, it's, well, let me start with just that. McElroy says on 270, quoting Cleveland, "When more of the people's substance is exacted through the form of taxation than is necessary to meet the just obligations of the government and the expense of its economical administration, such exaction becomes ruthless extortion and a violation of the fundamental principles of a free government." So part of it was just that it wasn't needed. And then the second insight that I think is insightful on Cleveland's part is that this is a tax that's paid not only by those that buy the foreign items, but it's also paid by those that buy the domestic item. In other words, if let's say an American car costs $50,000 and a Japanese car would cost $40,000, but a tariff is added of $10,000 to the $40,000, making them equal. Well, everyone that buys a Japanese car for $50,000 is paying a $10,000 tax to the government. But Cleveland's insight here is that also those that buy the American car for $50,000 are still paying that $10,000 more than they otherwise would need to, even though it's not a tax going to the government. It still has set a price higher than it otherwise would be. And so he took a stand on this, and in addition to there being good arguments on both sides of the tariff issue, the one argument is that we have to protect American workers and American industry, and the other is the tax argument that it's not fair to tax people for this. So you have, right-thinking people on both sides of that question. But then, in addition to that, what happened was lowering the tariff was also seen as benefiting the UK, because that would have stimulated more trade with them, and they were the industrial powerhouse at this time. And so demagogues, again, would whip up the Irish, who had strong anti-England sentiments due to their history, that lowering the tariff was, an abomination that was a pro-Britain move and aimed at suppressing the Irish. So here again, this just shows how difficult it is in the American democracy to rule in terms of good principles and not have to be dodging these demagogic bullets. He was politically unsavvy, according to some of his friends and advisors, to take up such a controversial issue in the run-up to the election. But his response was, what's the use of being reelected if you don't stand for something? So again, I think you see his willingness to stand on principle, even if it's going to cause his own downfall. He figured, what's the point of being elected if you don't stand for something? How different from most modern politicians. This is a tough issue, this tariff question. Donald Trump, of course, is talking about it in his rallies quite a lot. And he's not showing the same insight that Cleveland did. Trump is projecting this as a tax on the Chinese, for instance, if you levied a tariff on the Chinese. But I think all economists now agree that the Chinese aren't paying any tax, other than perhaps it would force them to lower their base price a bit to try to compete over on top of the tariff, and therefore cut into their profit margin a bit. But the bulk of the tariff is being paid by the American consumer, who's having to buy products now, as Cleveland insightfully noticed, whether buying it from China or from America. Now, when I was a libertarian, that would have clinched the argument that there should be no tariff. It's always unjust. I now can see that there's an argument for it. There's an argument for protecting industries if foreign governments are subsidizing to try to purposely destroy your industry, after which they plan to move in and jack prices way up. And that's a standard argument, and I know that's been discussed, and I'm no economist, so I'm not going to take a hard stand on that, but it does seem intuitively plausible that there's at least some merit there. And then the other concern, of course, would be the supply chains necessary for national defense. And we saw how badly the supply chains were disrupted, even with the COVID lockdowns, and how cars and other items needing semiconductors from the Orient, ended up with months-long backlog. Well, the military vehicles and equipment uses these chips also. And so now the libertarian would say, well, yeah, this is a good thing. It's going to make war less likely. And, I tend to agree with that. But on the other hand, if war is ever necessary, then you don't want to be stuck not being able to produce the goods that you need. So anyway, the tariff type of question is a true tragic type of topic where you can see kind of both sides, and it almost seems like a lose-lose topic, but yet very important one. Well, that covers enough for Grover Cleveland's first term. There was one other topic, and that is the gold versus silver coinage. But I think I'll defer discussing that until a third tape where we go through his second presidency, because that was again an issue during that period and continuing into subsequent administrations as well, for that matter. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this presentation. I've tried to give a little bit of detailed names and places and intuitive maps and so forth, imitating what I find helpful when I'm learning new material. And whether this is just your total exposure to Grover Cleveland, or if you want to acquire the book, and which is still in print, although they've reduced it to just one volume now, Robert McElroy. Sometimes it's helpful to have gone through it verbally in order to read it more quickly and with better assimilation. So I hope it's been interesting above all, and helpful. And like I said, after I finish reading the second volume, which is going to cover his second term after this intervening term from Harrison, I'll do a final video covering that. Hope to see you then.